It's Thursday, September 19th, 2024, and we are 46 days away from the election. Welcome to today's Make It Make Sense mini-episode. I'm Grant Herms. Today on the show, the fight over whether to keep the government open or send the national federal election into a tailspin is still going on as Republicans turn on one another. So yesterday, a week after Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, a Republican, pulled his own bill to fund the government off the House floor, it was back up for a vote again, and it was defeated by members of his own party. Now, I say that because technically, Republicans have the votes to pass this thing without any Democratic support, which they aren't going to get right now because Johnson is tying keeping the United States government running to a bill called the SAVE Act. I talked about the SAVE Act last week, but it's the bill that would require people to show proof that they're U.S. citizens when they go to register to vote, and it's riddled with all sorts of issues, but mostly that there's just no evidence that non-citizens are voting in U.S. elections in any meaningful or large numbers. Now, these laws end up really keeping eligible people from voting, as civil rights groups have said, and legal rights groups have pointed out that it'll make it really, really hard to run an election for election workers that's just 6 weeks away. Nevertheless, Republicans are sticking to it out of a concern, they say, for election integrity or election security, except for about 14 or 15 of them who voted with Democrats yesterday, tanking the bill. Here's what Johnson had to say about the bill's failure yesterday.
Well, everybody, you just watched the legislative process play out. The play that we ran tonight was the right play. It's the right fight for the American people. It's the one that they demand and deserve. I made it very clear over the last couple of weeks. We have two very important objectives right now. Congress has an obligation to fund the government, and Congress has an obligation to ensure that our elections are secure and fair and free. And this vote tonight would have accomplished both. I'm very disappointed that it didn't pass. I want to note that every Democrat except three went on record once again for the second time voting against election security. What the SAVE Act would have accomplished, as everyone knows, is to ensure that illegals and non-citizens cannot vote in the upcoming election. Right now, we have no mechanism for the states to require proof of citizenship before they register to vote. That is a serious problem. It is about an 88% issue in polling across the country, and it is not partisan. But we missed that. We ran the play. It was the best play. It was the right one. And so now we go back to the playbook. We'll draw up another play, and we'll come up with a solution. I'm already talking to colleagues about their many ideas. We have time to fix the situation, and we'll get right to it. I'm disappointed. I know this is the right thing to do, and I think the American people are going to let a lot of the folks that voted no tonight hear their concerns about it. So stay posted. Stay posted.
First of all, Johnson says something there that's not true. Most states have some sort of mechanism to prove you're a citizen when you register to vote, and if you can't prove that you're a citizen or that you're allowed to vote in most states, you're still allowed to vote on what's known as a provisional ballot, which is just a ballot you mark up until you can then prove that you were actually eligible or registered to vote. And that has worked for the better part of 30 years now because the federal law it comes from errs on the side of not taking away someone's rights because they didn't have their papers on them. Also, every state is now Real ID compliant, which means to get a federally compliant ID, you need to show citizenship. Also, there are a lot of Americans who don't have ready access to their proof of citizenship documents, or they don't have it at all. A study from the Brennan Center for Justice found around 21 million Americans don't have access to their citizenship documents, and almost 4 million people don't have them at all because they were lost or stolen or damaged in things like a fire or a flood, and this SAVE Act would end up barring those people from voting too. I know I harp on this idea, but the idea that our election integrity or security is somehow compromised when it comes to things like ballot counting or who's voting just isn't a real problem. And what it does is prevent people who should be able to vote from exercising a fundamental American right. And the people who push these things, while they might be honest in their concern for wanting election security and integrity, continue to ignore basic facts about the things we know about voting. And now I'm not in their heads as to why they keep doing that, but I will keep pointing out what the actual consequences of the bills they bring forward are. But let's get back to this funding fight. Now, when this was first put on the floor, it was already an uphill fight for Johnson. Like most of these government shutdown standoffs, both sides are just waiting for the other to blink. But Johnson knows that Democrats aren't going to give in on this, and in a normal political world, he'd take a few more swings at Democrats, and then the SAVE Act would be promised to be rolled into something else later, or the Senate would agree to make it a priority after the government gets funded, and the election could happen without utter chaos. Like he did the first time around, Trump sent out a mandate to the GOP. Yesterday afternoon, he posted on Truth Social where he said Republicans should not pass the Continuing Resolution, or CR, that's the thing that would fund the government, in any way, shape, or form without passing the SAVE Act, and demanded that it should happen before, not after the election, essentially saying the GOP should shut down the government. Now, the last time Trump did this, it really spooked a lot of swing state and swing district Republicans who are in tough races right now. Many of them are the same ones who voted to tank the CR plus SAVE Act package. It also puts Johnson in a really tight spot because the last time we had one of these fights before Johnson was Speaker, Republicans kicked out their leader, then Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy, for working across the aisle, among a few other inter-party problems. But it was really him reaching across the aisle to make sure the government was funded that led to him being ousted as the very first time a speaker was voted from their seat in U.S. history, and it led to 21 pretty embarrassing days without a congressional leader that left an entire branch of government rudderless. And members of the GOP have already threatened to oust Johnson, or at least have winked and nodded to a change in the rules that lets anyone call for a vote to oust the speaker before. And Johnson doesn't want to leave his very powerful post. I mean, he's third in line to the White House after being a nobody in Congress up until just a year ago. So does that mean he'll shut down the government on October 1st, which is just a month and 4 days before the presidential election? This was his answer.
We'll see what happens with the bill, all right? We're on the field in the middle of the game. The quarterback's calling the play. We're going to run the play. I'm very confident. I know that all the Republicans believe in election security. We have some people who dislike CRs. You know what? I dislike continuing resolutions as well, right? But here's the problem, and everybody needs to remember, it is not the House. It is not the House majority. It is not House Republicans that put us in this situation. We ran all of our 12 appropriations bills through committee. They did an extraordinary job, our appropriators. We funded over almost 73% of federal spending off the House floor in complete and total votes. The process bogged down. You know why? Because Chuck Schumer and the Senate have not put one approps bill on the floor. They have not even begun to do their job. So here we are at the fiscal cliff, the end of the fiscal year, September 30th is right upon us. We don't have two sets of bills, as is supposed to be the system, for the House and Senate to go and negotiate together because the Senate brings nothing to the table. So it is the Senate that has put us in the situation to have a CR to not shut the government down, to not discontinue all government services. We are the responsible governing party here, and we are doing the right thing. The right thing right now, by principle, by law, by the Constitution, is to ensure that our elections are secure. That's the number one concern, I think, for most of the American people. It's an 88% issue on the latest polling. It's not even a partisan issue. So we are going to force that with the last train leaving the station, which is the CR, and we'll see what happens.
So, one, Johnson calling Trump the quarterback is a weird bit of him giving up the power his office actually has, but it's also a good example of how the GOP is operating right now. Two, and more importantly, he's right that the Senate hasn't produced a spending plan of its own, but it's also not really the Senate's job right now. Spending and funding bills start in the House by law, and then they go to the Senate where changes happen or they get butted up against the Senate's version of that bill, and they go back and forth until everyone is sufficiently disappointed, and then that goes to the president's desk. And now Senate Democrats, who are in charge of the Senate, have said they're considering releasing their own version of a spending plan or a funding plan, which isn't unheard of, but it isn't a good look for House Republicans either, because it would make it look like they couldn't get their act together and then they needed someone else to come do their work for them. Leadership in the Senate has also said they'd be willing to pass what they're calling a clean CR, which just means a singular bill to fund the government without anything else attached to it, like the SAVE Act. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has floated the idea of pitching a bill to fund the government until December, which would secure the government through the election, but also butt members up next to the end of the year, which would force them to either find a solution or ruin their holidays, and they definitely don't want to do that either. And I know that plenty of people are wondering why the Democrats in the House just don't come to the table here. And that's a fair question. For starters, they know it doesn't really matter because Republicans have a majority, albeit a two-person majority, so the smallest in U.S. history, but a majority nonetheless. Now, second, Democrats publicly say they're standing on principle about opposition to the SAVE Act for a lot of the reasons that I talked about. And third, they know that this won't be their mess to clean up, and going into an election, and in this election year where we basically have a brand new election in the shortest amount of time we've ever seen, saying that it's Republicans who don't want to govern when we wanted to pass a government funding bill as Democrats, but they wanted to play politics, while actively playing politics themselves, is just an easy out for them. Also, this wait-and-see strategy worked for Democrats in the past when Republicans had to come kind of hat in hand to them last time around, and they had to give up a bunch of things so Democrats would say yes. I wouldn't be surprised if House Democrats are going to let the pressure build on Johnson before they make any sort of moves here. That doesn't make any of this less frustrating, though. And speaking of frustrating, as all of this is happening, the House as a whole doesn't really seem to be operating in panic mode here. Just 11 days before a full government shutdown, there are only 2 things on the schedule tomorrow that are just subcommittee hearings, meaning most members are going to skip town from D.C. and head home for the weekend. So, it's hard to feel like there's any kind of urgency here. And if you want to kick them in gear a little bit, call your representative's office. The threshold for getting a member of Congress to do something is so low it would shock you, because so few people actually call that when like a dozen people finally do, their ears perk up. You'd be surprised at the feedback you get, especially when we're this close to an election. Okay, that is it for today's MIMS Mini. Thank you so much for listening today. You can rate and review the show if you haven't done that already. Like and subscribe on YouTube, and subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack. I've got some new content coming very soon. I know it's been a little lax lately for those of you who are subscribers, so I'm sorry about that. Also, follow the show and share it on social media. It's MIMS News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word, on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.